My name is Sam.
And I'm Kelly. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case?
As you know, we are two women from Chicago, and we're here to tell you about some true crime. This week, Kelly has a case to present to us, and the way that this will be working, as we're still pretty new, is we'll be switching off telling stories to each other. So we'll be able to have conversations and not really know exactly what we're talking about until we're recording.
I would also like to shout out the help of the third member of our trifecta, Ashley, Sam's sister, and a first responder, whose insights were particularly invaluable in what we'll be talking about today.
And speaking of her, she's at a firefighter training tonight, which is the big reason she's not actually joining us. All right. One thing that we like to do when we start off our episodes, so that you can get to know us a little bit more, is we ask each other a question that's just a little more personal. And my question for you today, Kelly, is what sort of movies and shows did you watch with your family growing up?
My family and I did not watch a lot of shows together growing up because I was not allowed to watch a lot of shows growing up.
Oh,
but
really?
We did have regular Friends appearances.
Okay, Friends was a big staple in my household between me and my sister.
Yeah, it was always on.
Exactly, it was always on.
What about you?
And Ashley and I watched it probably too young, but we didn't get most of it, so it didn't really matter. Yeah, growing up in my house, we had a couple traditions where we always watched kind of the same thing. Every Sunday night, and for those of you who may not have listened to our intro episode, I grew up in the Chicago area and moved to Wisconsin when I was 9. But before I moved, we watched 2020 or Dateline every Sunday night. It was like our family thing. We went over to my grandma's house, we ordered a pizza, and we watched 2020 and Dateline. Probably why I am the way I am. So
that's how we got here.
Yeah, exactly. But one thing I actually discovered today, which makes me incredibly excited, there was a movie that came out in 1996. I went to see it in the theater with my mom and my sister and a couple of my mom's friends. And I found out today they are doing a sequel. And that movie is Twister. And I am so excited.
Twister is getting a sequel.
Yes. I was 6 years old in the theater. Again, I probably shouldn't have been there, but I fell in love with that movie. And there's a sequel coming out.
Maybe a little too young.
Yeah, it is what it is. I walked out of that theater loving it. I didn't understand most of it, but I thought tornadoes were fascinating. And I still do.
They're the reason there's a show called Storm Chasers that exists.
Exactly. And I've definitely watched probably every episode of it. Right, but what case are you bringing us today?
All right, you guys. I'm going to jump around in my notes already. Though we don't intend to cover only unsolved cases, this week I come to you with another case that has still not been brought to justice. And it's unfortunately not unlike many cases that have happened consistently to North America's Indigenous people. Today I'll be talking about just one of these stories, but it's important to remember that this is not an isolated crime.
Not at all.
In our recording timeline, which is the past for you who are listening, we recently marked the passing of what we now call Indigenous Peoples Day, but was for centuries known as Christopher Columbus Day. Living in Chicago, Sam and I are obviously around a lot of people with different opinions on this. As Native Americans were celebrating, there were still other parts of our city glorifying Columbus. I'm not sure if you heard, Sam. I thought there was at least one parade that I saw reported.
This year? I haven't heard anything about this year. I do remember
I'll have to
my
look
mom.
deeper into my sources.
I was I in town that weekend? I might not have been in town. I remember my mom telling me when I was in high school, my mom worked at the school and she sat in on a lot of student classes because she was a student support. And she learned for the first time while she was an adult how terrible Christopher Columbus was because our education system didn't teach us that. And she remembers sitting there.
It's
in
wild.
Class,
And something
fascinated and angry that she didn't know any of it.
Being that I left this out of my script, I should just bring it up right now. There's a fantastic book called Lies My Teacher Told Me that you all should definitely read. It's very good. It captures a lot of information that may have been overlooked in our elementary schools and such.
After you told my mom about that, she is so excited to read it.
It's a really good book. I flew through it. But here I should also acknowledge that the region we now call Chicago was the traditional homelands of many indigenous nations and remains home to diverse Native people today. The land we walk was and remains Native land. I would also like to add that this episode contains information that's potentially triggering for the already marginalized community of Native people. Please use your discretion when listening, and if you are, prepare to hear information that may be new to you and challenge your perceptions. So I'm just going to hit you with some statistics and facts up top so that we really get a picture of the scale of these cases. The statistics that I'm presenting now are from the last study done in 2016. You may have heard about crime rates on reservations, but Indigenous people are also targeted at an alarming rate in urban areas. Approximately 71% of American Indians and Alaska Natives live in urban areas. In 2016, 5,712 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls were reported. Only 116 were logged into the DOJ database.
Wow.
Murder is the number 3 most common cause of death in American Indian and Alaska Native women. In 2017, the Urban Indian Health Institute, a tribal epidemiology center, identified 506 cases that they were able to access from urban areas populated with a high number of Native Americans. 128, 25% of those cases were listed as a missing persons case. 280, 56% were murder cases. And 98, 19% had an unknown status. Approximately 75% of these cases had no tribal affiliation. So it's not, again, it's not coming from the reservation. These are all things that are happening in our hometown. Chicago was actually one of the cities that the UIHI pulled data from.
Wow.
Yeah, and here's a big trigger warning for all listening. The next fact is quite gruesome and contains reference to child abuse. The youngest victim was a baby under a year old, and the oldest was 83. These numbers all come from the study conducted by UIHI and was published on Native Hope, who focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
That's just absolutely insane.
It's so more insidious than I knew.
It is. And I grew up near a Native reservation. I recently took you up to go visit my hometown, and you saw a little bit of it. We didn't actually go over to the reservation. We were in town for some specific activities. But I grew up going to school with a pretty good amount of Natives. And you can see just through my school system that it's messed up, which makes me so sad. And I had so many friends growing up on the reservation and spending a lot of time out there with them. And it was hard to see some things, for sure.
Yeah. And, actually, being that we were that close to reservation land and I never had been before is what inspired me to do this as one of my first cases here on the podcast. Because
I'm glad that inspired you, because it's a big deal. It's something that needs to be talked about. It is.
I also had read Lies My Teacher Told Me, which so much was provided with more context surrounding what's happened to Native Americans in this country. And then the ignorance that I had that there were even reservations up around there where your family was from, I knew that I needed to be looking at things like this. This is something that I needed to dive into.
I've seen a handful of podcasts do like monthly episodes about Indigenous women. And I think that's an incredible thing because it clearly, just with your statistics, so much has been brushed under the table and not addressed. That needs to change.
Wild, because again, there are 5,712 cases and only 116 were logged into the DOJ database.
That something's wrong. Like something is legitimately wrong there. And I don't know what it is, but it needs to change.
Yeah, but it's worth talking about, and I'm going to talk about it some more. And I hope all those numbers gave some of you some red flags, like Sam and I. And I'll here mention that many Indigenous people who live in urban areas are often the victims of forced relocation and systemic racism. I could do an entire episode on the injustices that have been perpetrated on this community of people, but I'd prefer to show it to you with my story today about Sherry Ann Wounded Foot. As we talk about Sherry's case, I'd again encourage you to remember that this is one of many, many, many stories. And I know we've touched on that a lot, but my intention, as I told Sam off air, was I wanted to present maybe a couple cases that had gone unsolved. But the murder of Sherry Ann Wounded Foot is it's so instrumental in this topic. The story just needs to be told.
You want to give her her time.
Yes, we're going to give her what she deserves, what she's owed. Sherry Ann Wounded Foot was born in 1966 in Rapid City, South Dakota, to Jonas Sr. and Florence Nay Tuttle Wounded. Sherry Ann was a member of the Oglala Sioux from the Pine Ridge. Sherry lived in Porcupine Pine Ridge Reservation, which is in Manderson White Horse Creek, South Dakota. Sherry Ann was described by her children as a loving mother, but also a tough, feisty woman, which her son said could have been attributed to her small stature. Sherry Ann was also a loving sister to her brother, Sanford Wounded Foot, whom she always kept an open door for, it was reported. Sherry Ann would drive across the border of South Dakota to Whiteclay, Nebraska, where he, quote, often drank on the streets with other Oglala Sioux men and women, to pick him up and take him to her home on the Pine Ridge Reservation to eat and bathe. Here I'd like to mention that there are widespread stereotypes about Native Americans and drinking. I'm sure many of you have heard them, and I'll try my best to acknowledge where the consumption of alcohol may not be relevant to the story and may be sensationalism. Though it was established that Sherry Ann's brother was a drinker, this widespread stereotype will come back as a point of discussion. This pattern of behavior between Sherry Ann and Sanford has been documented through the year of 2012, but likely went on prior to it as well. In December 2012, to Sherry Ann and her family's heartbreak, her brother was found beaten and left for dead in the heart of Whiteclay, Nebraska. Sanford Wounded Foot died from the injuries sustained, and as of today, no arrests have been made in his death. Sheridan County Attorney's Office said it didn't suspect foul play in Sanford Wounded Foot's death. Sherry Ann's eldest son, Logan Lafferty, says that the family never learned how he died and no one has been charged. Unfortunately, this was only the beginning of the suffering of this family.
So if he was found beaten, how is there no foul play suspected? Like that,
I do not know.
That's something that, and that's not unheard of either, which is mind-blowing.
Right. And also it says something to me that Logan Lafferty, Sherry Ann's son, says his family never learned how he died.
Yeah, not even giving documentation of a death certificate to the family. That should all be happening as well.
Right. There was no even formal diagnosis of death given. I'm sure I'm using the wrong word for that. Cause of death. There was no formal cause of death given to the family from what the family says now.
That's ridiculous.
All this family knows is that Sherry Ann's brother, an uncle, a family member, was beaten and left for dead in the middle of town. And they were never given any answers.
As if it just doesn't matter, which is wrong.
I hate that that's the beginning of this. Unsolved murder. Potential murder. Alleged murder. They didn't suspect foul play, is Sheridan County Attorney's Office's official statement. On August 5th, 2016, at 9:45 a.m., emergency responders received a call for an ambulance at the Lakota Hope Ministry building in Whiteclay, Nebraska. When they arrived, they found Sherry Ann Woundedfoot unconscious behind the building in an eerily similar fashion to the way her brother Sanford was found. As we move through this story, I'm also going to share the ongoing lawsuit filed by Sherry Ann's daughter, Sandra Graham. This will be relevant as we discuss the next 24 hours of Sherry Ann's life. At first, when ambulance workers arrived, they did not believe Sherry Ann had been assaulted. But when they transported her to Pine Ridge Hospital at the Indian Health Service emergency room to get checked. Pine Ridge Hospital is located on the reservation and is an ambulatory care center with outpatient services. She arrived at that hospital at 10:05 a.m. So in the 20 minutes between 9:45 a.m. and 10:05 a.m., Sheriff Terry Robbins arrived at the scene and was told by ambulance personnel that Woundedfoot did not appear to have been assaulted and would be taken to Pine Ridge Hospital. He then left the scene, and at 10:05 a.m., the ambulance medics made the determination that, quote, no emergency existed before dropping her off at the Indian Health Service emergency room.
That doesn't make sense just in the statement of no emergency existed, but an ambulance is still dropping the person off at an emergency room.
Right.
When they're called for somebody who is unconscious behind a building.
Right. No emergency existed. And the lucky thing is, after I read you a couple more paragraphs, you're going to have a couple more questions like that. And who's going to enter our world but Ashley, the first responder, who has a little clarity there for us. And some more questions.
He says.
And some more questions created.
I know that you just emailed her, and so I don't know any of this.
More questions created, some answers given. Sandra Graham, Sherry Ann's daughter, filed a lawsuit in 2019 against the federal government for negligence on the part of Pine Ridge Ambulance Service and hospital staff. She alleged the staff failed to recognize a life-threatening head injury that required immediate treatment, which eventually led to Sherry's death. The lawsuit further states that medics on scene, quote, failed to properly diagnose and triage Woundedfoot because when they examined her, they didn't note any obvious trauma, even though she had blood and bruises on her body. Graham alleges that medics determined no emergency existed when indeed this was a critical, life-threatening situation. I had a lot of confusion when I first interpreted the lawsuit, and luckily we have our own first responder, Ashley, to help me clarify. One of my first questions...
Yes, and she is a phenomenal first responder, so she I'm sure, is a huge help.
She knows what's up, y'all, and she helped me understand what should have happened here and what could have happened here. But one of my first questions was, does a first responder have the ability to overrule the sheriff if they understand the situation more? So if this sheriff were to determine, no, I think she has a life-threatening head wound, They can, according to Ashley, but in Ashley's experience, it usually doesn't happen. When she works with the sheriff's department, they don't often question if she has concerns. So, in this situation, it may not have been strange for the sheriff to leave based upon the reports they received from ambulance personnel. However, this leads to my next question. Who should this sheriff have talked to, and who did he actually talk to? The question was, who should this cop have talked to? Does there need to be some sort of official doctor or someone on board whose job this is? And in this case, I mean declaring there is no medical emergency. To which Ashley has given us a breakdown of who arrives at the scene and who has say here, which is very helpful. She says there are different levels of EMS. EMR is the emergency medical responder, who is usually a volunteer or a member of the fire department. Most of the time, the first person on the scene, and they respond from their homes. They can give life-saving care without medications, but they're meant to stabilize a patient until the next higher up in service gets there. They cannot transport a patient. They cannot sign off a patient, meaning they cannot check out a patient, do some care, and say, okay, you're good to go. A higher level needs to be present to make that determination. The EMR is out. The cop definitely couldn't or shouldn't have spoken with them. The next category is an EMTB, which is an Emergency Medical Tech Basic. This is a paid position or a volunteer with an ambulance service. Ambulances can have an EMT be paired with a paramedic. An ambulance can have just 2 basics, but they can transport and give simple care without meds, called basic life support ambulance. And the big Mac Daddy of them all is the paramedic. It's the highest level. This is the man who can give the drugs. If there's a patient who they have been working with, but they're not seeing any signs of life, they need to contact medical control to stop treatment and declare death.
Okay, that makes sense. I know I've heard a little bit of this before from her, but this is broken down in a very clear way.
3 separate situations here on who this cop could have spoken to. My next question was, who makes the call and when of no medical emergency? Ashley shared with me in her experience, the sheriff can call off first responders, but she has only had that happen in a call where there's obviously no medical need. For example, a medical alert button pushed by mistake or a car accident where both parties are uninjured. And that was Ashley's statement. Here's my statement that I conjecture. It sounds like in this case, a paramedic should absolutely have been the one to make this call, but the articles don't specify who the sheriff spoke with or confirm that it was a paramedic or even an EMTB. It seems in this case, the disagreements between whether there was an assault or not were conflicting and affected this outcome. Articles only specified that the sheriff spoke to, quote, ambulance staff, which perhaps answers my next question to Ashley, which was, why name the ambulance service staff in the lawsuit? Ashley posited this could be to name as many people as possible that potentially could have been at fault to get the best outcome of the lawsuit. I think it does seem widely reaching to name everyone on the ambulance, and I'm sure Ashley would agree, and Sam, maybe you as well. I suppose were I the victim, I might do the same. I hate to think of being in that position of wanting the negligence to lie somewhere, but I don't know that it's with the ambulance service staff in this case, because I'll go on to detail a few more facts.
Well, there's a couple things that I do know when it comes to the fire department, and I don't know if this is necessarily in relation to medical, but I do know, for instance, if there's a fire and obviously the fire department responds, they actually have full control of the scene. So if police arrive, their support.
Right. Okay.
And when you're being called to an accident where an ambulance is responding and you're having first responders and a whole different kind of collective of people, the first responders, EMTB, and paramedic, they're working with the fire department. So I don't know how different that is when it comes to medical versus fire. But another example is if the jaws of life are needed for a car accident. Fire department controls that. They are the ones who are, say, telling the cops, you need to direct traffic out of this area because we need our equipment in to open up this car and save this person's life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know where that stops and kind of how that is, but that could potentially be part of this as well.
It also shakes out very strangely with the hospitals and the hospital staff, fire departments, and law enforcement. Will come back a little bit when we talk at the end about the town of Whiteclay. And something that does become a problem is it, as I imagine fire and police would both deal with as well. Whiteclay is directly on the border of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So once you hit the reservation, you are also dealing with separate entities there as well. So the Pine Ridge Hospital is a hospital.
I have one question before you move on to this next part. Was this, because I know a lot of reservations have their own police department. Mm-hmm. Was this a reservation police department and fire response? Or was it from a neighboring community that isn't part of the reservation?
That is a good question.
I know not every reservation has their own specific department. I think it depends on population and how much land there is for the reservation. So I'm just curious if you know that.
I believe this is a reservation response because Sherry Ann's daughter has filed negligence on the part of the Pine Ridge Ambulance Service. And Pine Ridge is the reservation. Okay. I'm assuming
that makes sense. That's kind of what I assumed.
Yes. I'm assuming it was, a response from the tribal end of it. And which makes sense that they would say, take her to Pine Ridge Hospital. At Pine Ridge Hospital, an emergency room nurse who treated Wounded Foot described her as, quote, unresponsive, but said that she moved when an IV was inserted, according to the lawsuit. Here's where the stereotype I mentioned regarding Native Americans and alcohol comes back into play. The nurse also noted that Wounded Foot, quote, had been drinking for 3 days, which inspires a lot of questions on my part. How could this medical professional know that she had been drinking for 3 days? Seems like a very specific frame of time. Seems like a very specific frame of time for someone to recognize when the patient is unconscious and unresponsive, according to you. Seems like a very specific time. Another question, were there any toxicology records to confirm that level of drinking? None that I have been able to find. And for me, most importantly, how is this relevant to her critical injuries and potential death?
Yeah, regardless if she's been drinking for days or not, and if she's potentially on this binge, there still seems to be evidence that she was beaten. And that should have zero relation to it when it comes to the facts of her
exactly.
injury.
We've had multiple medical professionals examine her now, except I should relay that I believe most of these medical professionals are still under the assumption that an assault has not taken place, which would lead me to question, did you not examine her thoroughly, or did you just pick her up and decide, well, she's been drinking for 3 days, send her to the regular hospital? Those are my questions.
Yeah, or she's drinking for 3 days and she doesn't deserve our care.
Exactly.
And which is never acceptable, ever. But it happens, unfortunately.
Exactly. And we'll hear sort of statements that fortunately align with some of those. I will say that the statement was made only once by the Rapid City Journal and had no mention in future articles. In my opinion, and remember, it's only mine, I think that this is sensationalism on the journalist's part. The nurse gave her oxygen and other treatment as her condition began to regress. It has no bearing upon her injuries. It is just a note that found its way into a publication anyone can read that is not relevant to her murder.
I'd be curious to go back and read some other articles by that same journalist and see if you can kind of pinpoint other similar misconceptions. Because maybe that's just the journalist bias speaking, which is awful, but I kind of hope that's all it is. But he's or she, whoever's writing it, is spreading that word and continuing that misconception.
Right. It's very yucky. Luckily, it only appeared in they did about 3 articles, nowhere near enough, about 3 articles on her death, and it was mentioned in one of them, but not in the other 2. So I don't know why they felt the need to bring that into the narrative, but they did. We are still on August 5th at 12:09 p.m. Sherry Ann had a seizure at Pine Ridge Hospital. So for 2.5 hours or longer, depending on how long her body lay behind Hope Ministries, she had not been given the medical care that her extreme injuries required. The seizure prompted Pine Ridge personnel to contact Rapid City Regional Hospital for help. This hospital required a CAT scan before they would accept a patient transfer, so the Pine Ridge staff ordered the test, again, approximately 2.5 hours after she arrived at the hospital. The CAT scan revealed she had bleeding in her brain and needed immediate surgery. Sandra Graham's lawsuit alleges that Pine Ridge Hospital, quote, has a history of not ordering CAT scans because they are poorly trained and don't want to pay for them. It further states this type of situation is ongoing for years, with no learning from previous mistakes and deaths, and is grossly reckless for the hospital's Native American patients, unquote.
That's ridiculous. Because one of my first things, I hadn't mentioned it, but when you were talking about the injuries and the no emergency, whatever, was the ability, like her potentially having internal injuries that they can't see.
Right.
So if you see someone passed out, and even if she has a couple external injuries, they need to be treating that as she could have multiple internal injuries, and that needs to be immediately assessed. And the way to assess that is a CAT scan.
Yes, and particularly if you suspect any trauma around the head, that needs to be addressed immediately, which will come back very shortly in this lawsuit.
I know a handful of years ago, my grandmother was in a hospital for routine surgery, but she was exceptionally groggy after coming out of the anesthesia, where they thought she was potentially having a stroke.
Oh, no.
And it turned out it was just the medication combination of things, and she didn't react to it terribly well. She just was super groggy, but she was slurring words, and they just weren't sure. And they pushed us out of the room and rushed her to a CAT scan.
Oh.
Because that's what you're supposed to do.
Right. Exactly. I mean, and if you have someone who's unresponsive and is only, the nurse said she responded when the IV was put in, which is one of...
That's not considered responsive. That's a muscle. That's not her speaking and actually being able to articulate anything.
Right. And I don't know, anything surrounding the head or internal you need CAT scans, CT scans, and the place that she was transported to just did not have these resources because it was determined there was no medical emergency. So she should be sent to the smaller tribal hospital.
So if she were in a position where she had the ability to verbally respond, could they have just been, oh, go home? That's what it sounds like to me.
Sounds a little like that. Until, in this case, it sounds like they would have been content to do that until they realized that she was declining and they had to contact Rapid City Regional Hospital. And Rapid City Regional Hospital,
which was a couple hours too late.
Right. Rapid City Regional Hospital is getting in here and getting the real details of what happened to Sherry Ann. Unfortunately, it's happening at 1:25 p.m., approximately 4 hours after she arrived at Pine Ridge. A medical helicopter arrived to take her to Rapid City Regional Hospital, but by then the delay in diagnosing her serious head injury meant she wasn't treated during what they call the golden hour, when she had her best chance at recovery, the lawsuit says. Rapid City Regional Hospital staff also noticed what Pine Ridge did not: bruises on Sherry Ann's face, and ordered a CT scan that confirmed she had bleeding in her brain and head, as well as fractured ribs and fluid, likely blood, inside her abdomen, the lawsuit says. Regional hospital staff performed brain surgery on Sherry Ann at 4:42 p.m. True to her tough and feisty nature, Sherry Ann tolerated the procedure well, according to the staff. I wasn't aware of this, what they call the golden hour with head trauma.
I haven't heard of that either, but it makes a lot of sense. Just in general medical anything, the longer you put off getting treatment for anything, just the worse it gets.
It's true. You're right. And yeah, so this is, I mean, if it's called the golden hour, 4 hours since she's arrived at the Pine Ridge Hospital, and who knows how long she was laying unconscious prior to that.
What's blowing my mind in all of this, and I've reminded myself a couple times as you've been speaking, is this is what, 2016?
Correct.
This is recent. This isn't even...
Correct.
Like older when they didn't fully understand medical needs. Like this is recent. They should know all of it.
Right. And why was it not performed immediately? Why? Again, it's the crux of many of my questions on this. Why? And a lot of it does come back to thinking, who is this mystery person who said there was no medical emergency, who caused the sheriff to leave? Who
is there the possibility, and I know you said they were in different places, but any possibility that her beating and her brother's beating had the same responding first responders or firefighting team and EMS or police?
I don't know, but I will.
Were they far enough apart where that wouldn't be possible?
No, they were found extremely close. So I would say that there's a high probability it was the same because
that's interesting.
It doesn't come till way later in my script, but later, I should say it right now. The town of Whiteclay is 12 people. You can count them if you take your shoes off.
Oh.
Yeah, there's 12 people in this town.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I come from a small town, but my town is massive in comparison to that.
Right. There's 12 people actually who live in this place. Because we'll see later, it is sort of a transitory space. But I think it's extremely likely that the responding officers could have been the same. I think the EMT crew could have been the same. The family certainly has opinions on it, which I have in here.
Are they all native?
The family or the responding officers?
The residents. Is this strictly a native reservation where, because there are some where if you live on the reservation and you are a certain percentage Native, you get additional benefits and different sorts of rights that others aren't allowed to have.
So yes, Sherry is a member of this tribe on Porcupine Pine Ridge. Let me just make sure I'm getting that right.
I'm just curious if all 12 residents are part of the same tribe.
I don't think so, because Whiteclay it lives right on the border of the Pine Ridge Reservation. So it is not reservation territory.
Okay. That makes a difference too.
I think the people who live there, if I had to venture a guess, I would say most of the people who live there operate the very few businesses that are there. And we'll talk about what kind of businesses are there and what's going on.
Yes, I'm jumping ahead. I just have so many questions.
Oh, no, it's okay. I told you before we recorded, I texted you that I was so far down the rabbit hole on this that I just, I had to subscribe and give my $1 to the Rapid City Journal because I needed to know. And I couldn't just have my source information be one extremely well-researched Reddit thread.
Yeah, as much as they reliable, they're so not reliable.
It was a great Reddit thread, but it was a Reddit thread. And though it was all factually backed up by these articles that I was able to obtain, we have the sources cited, and we will share them with you. The next day, after learning of her hospitalization, Sherry's family contacted law enforcement to suggest that she may have been the victim of a violent attack. As reported by one outlet, several years prior to her death, Sherry pleaded guilty to assault with a dangerous weapon after stabbing a man in the abdomen in 2009. The source alleged she was still awaiting sentencing at the time of the report, but it is unclear whether Sherry ever served time for the offense. In my opinion, this information is not totally reliable. It was only reported in one Reddit thread. Sherry Ann was allegedly, quote, awaiting sentencing, but why would she be waiting 7 years from the time of this attack to the time of her murder to be sentenced? To me, unclear if she served time means she did not, as if she did, there would be some sort of record. And the only reason I bring up this sketchy source is to highlight for you the danger Sherry Ann could have been experiencing that would require her to be armed. She may have faced other encounters in Whiteclay while picking up her brother, or even just trying to protect herself.
You and I were even speaking before this about us needing to protect ourselves, like you just going and walking your dog outside.
Absolutely. Living in Chicago is a wild experience sometimes, y'all. Sam and I often text each other, "Are you safe?"
Yeah, I think you and I have a fairly similar reaction to like, okay, I'm going to go do this, this, and this. I'm going to be done at this time. We both kind of know, like, if you don't hear from me in 24 hours, because we talk basically every single day, something's probably wrong.
Right, something's popping. It's time to shoot a text or maybe even leave a voicemail. I know how scared we all are of them, but it might be time.
Yeah, there was even a news article, and it was technically in your neighborhood, but you live in a huge neighborhood, so it wasn't technically close to you. But 3 people were abducted the other night. 3 people.
Yes, ma'am. I saw that article. 3 separate abductions and robberies. From the word separate I saw in the headline, I assume they mean unconnected, or?
From what I read, yeah, I think they're assuming it was the same suspects, but they were like hour and a half to 2 hours apart from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So one person was abducted, thrown into a car, their wallet, their phone, any kind of valuable belongings were stolen from them, and they were dropped off in a random location. And then they went back and did it 2 more times.
Yep, and all from a neighborhood quite close to mine. But it's still, I'm sure, on your mind and often on my mind, just having to be safe. Like having to have the knowledge that, okay, I have pepper spray if I need it. I have a well lit street. But in Sherry's case, she may not have had those things. She may have had to be armed to defend herself.
Well, and in those rural areas, there's not many lights. There's not street lights or things. Like, I grew up in the pitch black. Like, there was nothing by my house when I was growing up. And I grew up, like, I moved a handful of times as a kid up in Wisconsin. There were times I literally was in the middle of the woods with nothing.
Clearly, something happened.
Like, if there was a cloudy night coming home and you didn't have a light, and this is all before cell phones, before, like, you had a flashlight in your pocket.
Right.
And walking to your house, you can't see your house in front of you sometimes because it is that dark.
It's, a situation probably very much like that. Probably one in which you would feel safer being armed. And after speaking with her family, Sherry Ann's family, the sheriff's office contacted Pine Ridge Hospital and learned Wounded Foot had been transferred to Rapid City Regional Hospital in Rapid City, South Dakota. A hospital official there confirmed she had injuries consistent with a possible assault.
At least someone's saying it.
So this is different than what we have been hearing all the way up to this point. The next day, after Sherry has already been admitted to the hospital, I think possible is we're stretching the bounds of possible, but at least it's been declared an assault. On August 17th, 2016, Sherry Ann Wounded Foot succumbed to the injuries sustained in her assault after being hospitalized for 12 days. She was only 50 years old.
Well, when you think about that, too, you said there's 12 people that live in this town. Her and her brother seem to have both been murdered. That's pretty high statistic in murders per population.
An official investigation was launched into Sherry Ann's death, but her family did not believe law enforcement took her death or the deaths of so many other Indigenous people seriously. As Logan Lafferty, Sherry Ann's son, put it in September 2016, quote, "Each death in Whiteclay seems like nobody could care less, like us natives aren't human." I mean, in looking at this case, it, to me, feels like the same perpetrator. I'll get close, but again, like I said, it's unsolved. So we will get as close as we can. In even more current days, in 2017, Sheridan County Attorney Jamie Ann Simmons shared information that Wounded Foot's injuries and where she may have been assaulted is conflicted. Though it should be mentioned that when interviewed in May of 2022, Sandra Graham, that's Sherry Ann's daughter, said that in the hospital, quote, "I can see fingernail marks on her hands and her arms, and I can see bruising, like fingerprint bruising on her legs and her arms," Graham said. She said, "And it was really odd things that I noticed. That's when I knew something was wrong." Graham suspects her mother was abused, but she never got answers for what really happened. She said, quote, "I knew it was a crime. I already knew. Just something inside me told me what I already knew. But it just seemed like it didn't dawn on anybody, or nobody believed me because of where she was found. It was like she was less of a person because she was found in Whiteclay."
I'm assuming they never did an autopsy on her brother. They don't even have a cause of death.
Correct.
So you don't suspect foul play. How did he die?
Right.
So even if they do, well, if they do, they can't even potentially compare crime that way.
Yeah, because there's no cause of death for Sanford. And also because he was just filed away in the did not suspect foul play folder.
Like, it seems like he was assaulted as well. They can't even compare the type of attack to link them.
Exactly, which is confusing to me because if you found someone with head trauma and it's not consistent with them falling backward, I'm confused. While Sanford was not given the dignity of an autopsy, Sherry Ann was, and it showed she died of blunt trauma to the head, leading authorities to deem her death a, quote, potential homicide. And this inspires more questions for me. Maybe, Sam, you know some answers. Maybe you'll share some questions with me. What is a, quote, potential homicide? How is it different from an outright homicide investigation? What would stop someone from declaring this a homicide?
I think a lot of it just has to do with needing more evidence to go in either direction. I kind of look at this similarly to the Ellen Greenberg case. I know you and I talk about that a lot off air. There's a lot happening at the moment in that case.
Yes.
Correct. But you kind of look at how that one went back and forth between homicide and suicide. And for those of you who aren't terribly familiar, Ellen Greenberg was found in her apartment alone with, is it like 19 stab wounds? One of them,
I believe, may even have been in excess of 19.
It's 19 or more, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
One of them was in the back of her neck, and it severed part of her spinal cord. And the knife was found in her chest. So that wound on the back of her neck clearly had to have happened before the chest wound, because that's where the knife was left. And her fiance broke down the door and found her like that. And there's no evidence of an intruder. And so it went back and forth between suicide and homicide on the death certificate multiple times.
Yeah.
That never got to potential homicide, but I would assume that probably would have been a smarter declaration to make than just going back and forth. Because I think that would require more research and more investigation.
Yeah, I guess I mean, that's a very good point. I'd never heard the phrase potential homicide used before. I thought that there was a more, a neater, more by the book definition of.
I think it's meant to be super temporary. Like, we think it's homicide.
Yeah.
You do your investigation and you come back with us and let us know what your investigation comes.
Since you've enlightened me, that is a very good point, because we can talk a little bit about the investigation. I don't know if you're wrong, is the thing. I mean, because we're going to hear next about their investigation. So maybe it was only meant to be a placeholder, but in cases like this that go unsolved, it unfortunately just hangs around. Simmons, who I referenced before, Sheridan County attorney, further stated agencies involved in the investigation include the Sheridan County Sheriff's Department, Nebraska State Patrol, Pennington County Sheriff's Office in South Dakota, and criminal investigators with the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Pine Ridge. Since then, in 2017, or as early as it was reported, authorities have interviewed several people as possible witnesses, according to Simmons. Quote, law enforcement is actively pursuing all avenues of investigation, she said. Which, to me, presents more questions. If there are possible witnesses, what information have they gotten? Why has this not led to a suspect description or an eyewitness sketch? Where is the physical evidence? From the reporting, it seems we may not even know if Sherry Ann was murdered where she was found or if she was placed there.
Yeah, I guess if they said that there was no emergency, there might not have been any follow-up investigation at the scene in a timely fashion.
Yeah. It seems like that can only be the case. Like this declaration of it not being an emergency and the sheriff leaving the scene is just sort of the catalyst for this whole thing. You know, if the sheriff had been on the scene longer, maybe, you know, something would have happened. What I would hope would happen after interviewing several people as possible witnesses, there might be some sort of suspect description.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know why it's not led to any kind of description, or an eyewitness sketch might be too much to ask. Maybe it was nighttime, you know, but if we've interviewed several possible witnesses, how tall is the person? Did you see any clothes? You know, what? And none of this
Well, just the
is
fact
reported.
that there are several possible witnesses shows there was a crime of some sort.
Yes, yeah. I would just expect it, by Simmons' own quote, several people as possible witnesses. So I would assume from maybe at least one of them, we would have some sort of description, but no such account has been given.
But could they even provide a timeline? If they saw stuff, do they know what time they saw anything? Like, currently, we don't even know that.
No, we don't. And that's all questions that I have, that if that information has been asked, if that, you know, what have these witnesses told you? What questions have you been asking them? You know?
Yeah, that's interesting.
It did make changes, Sherry Ann's death. In 2017, at a Nebraska Liquor Control Commission hearing, a Winnebago activist and documentarian argued that Sherry Ann Woundedfoot's death, quote, shows Whiteclay's 4 beer stores should be shut down because the town lacks any permanent law enforcement presence. More questions here. Why is there no permanent law enforcement presence in Whiteclay? How were past assaults such as Sanford's investigated? Why was this issue not raised before 2017?
So I might be able to answer a little bit here, especially when it comes to law enforcement presence. Having only 12 people live in that area, I can easily understand a neighboring community kind of adopting Whiteclay into their law enforcement. I guess it would also depend on like square mileage, but they probably don't have the funding to have law enforcement presence if the town is that small. I know where I grew up, not every single town has their own fire department. They share a lot, or if they do, it's very, very small. For example, when Ashley gets a call, she lives in one of the smaller towns, because where I grew up, it's a handful of towns that kind of all come together to make a bigger area. It's still very, very small. There's only about 5,000 people to the whole area. But she can get a call as a first responder and have to drive 30 miles out because she's the closest person who has the ability to respond. I can't tell you how many times we've just been sitting at dinner and she gets a call and she just jumps up and runs away because she has to go do her job.
Yeah. John Maish, a former Oklahoma alcohol regulator who made a documentary about the town of 12, said of Sherry Ann's murder, Whiteclay has claimed another life. Further, Whiteclay is a lawless place, end quote. Maish also criticized the Sheridan County authorities for failing to notify the public or media about Sherry Ann Woundedfoot's injuries and death, or about the possibility of a violent perpetrator on the loose in the area. This criticism from across the board led the county to close all liquor-related businesses.
But we have no confirmation that liquor's actually involved.
True. Very true. And that it's being called a lawless place is very troubling to me. And the reason it's coming up at this Nebraska Liquor Control Commission hearing is the Whiteclay area borders right against the Pine Ridge Reservation. That is a dry reservation. And
Oh, interesting. Okay.
yes. And so Whiteclay is said to be where most of the locals get their alcohol. And why,
Understandably, being right next door.
right, and why somebody may accuse Sanford of being like drunk and passed out with other Oglala Sioux men in Whiteclay, because that's where it's sold. They can't obtain it on the reservation. However, after Sherry Ann Wounded Foot's death, they closed all of them.
So there has to be something that we don't know, or they're just acting out of spite of some sort.
And I think it lives somewhere in this area where he's criticizing the Sheridan County authorities, and I think rightly so, for failing to notify the public or media about her injuries and death. No one knew. Or about the possibility of a violent perpetrator loose in the area. No one knew. That's another thing that is troubling to me. Why would this not have been, why would the community not have been informed?
Well, also, if you then have an outsider's point of view, you have the benefit of retrospect to be like, oh, something very oddly similar happened to her brother.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have that ability in retrospect. You can correct
Right.
all of your mistakes from before if you do the right thing.
Right. And if you find yourself having this realization, you can then make that announcement to the public about her injuries and her death and the possibility of this perpetrator in the area. And you can get further statements from witnesses who may be able to help these families. Because we have to remember, this happened in 2016 too. So is there anyone out there with security camera footage? Is there anyone who knows anything? If the story isn't told, it's not solved.
Well, even, I don't know, there's a specific name for it, and I don't know the name, but there is the ability to track cell phones in a certain area. So you can actually do some sort of search, and it probably needs warrants and things. So you actually need people fighting for these people. But you can do a search of all of the cell phones that pinged in that area. If you have a town of 12 people,
come on,
that should not be a huge search.
Yes, it should not. It should not. And now we've chronologically come back to 2019 when Sherry's daughter, Sandra Graham, filed her lawsuit alleging negligence on the part of the ambulance and hospital staff at Pine Ridge. The question asked by a Redditor was, could Sherry Ann Wounded Foot's death have been prevented by more comprehensive medical treatment for injuries sustained in an assault? I think this question is relevant, and we've certainly discussed it today. But I think the other questions we've asked are just as valid. Where is the follow-up and justice here for, by all accounts, a vibrant, helpful member of the community? How can a town of 12 claim 2 members of the same family in almost identical fashions? Where's the physical evidence and eyewitness testimony? How many people saw Sherry Ann beaten and dying before she was found? Sadly, all of these questions remain unanswered. Sherry Ann Wounded Foot was survived by her aforementioned son and daughter, Logan Lafferty and Sandra Graham, another daughter, Dawn Rose Dowdy, a godson, 2 brothers, and 13 grandchildren. They were all robbed of her loving presence in their family by a perpetrator still at large. No arrests have been made in connection with Sherry Ann Wounded Foot's death. If you have any information regarding her murder, you're encouraged to contact the Oglala Sioux Police Department at 605 867 5141.
It just drives me nuts that there's so many questions.
There's so many facets to this case, and the more that I looked at it, the more that I was trying to I didn't want to condense, because so much of the information felt so critical to the story.
Yeah, and I think the information that you gave us, it sounds like that's kind of all the information that there is, which is infuriating.
It is infuriating because not only has this been unsolved since 2016, this lawsuit that Sherry's daughter, Sandra Graham, has filed in 2019, I was unable to find if that lawsuit had reached its conclusion or not.
And it could still be going on, so there might not be a conclusion yet.
Exactly. It could still be in litigation. I had to register my information with a website that is going to let me look, but they first have to verify me. I want to know where this case stands. I just want to know what happened, and there are so many questions that are just unanswered.
You and I have talked a lot about how we have a lot of interests in unsolved cases. We both find them interesting to talk about, and not interesting in necessarily an entertainment way. Like, yes, podcasts are a form of entertainment, but you and I like to talk about theories, and we like to kind of look at what's in front of us and just have a discussion.
Yeah.
And this one leaves me wanting so much more.
I know. And that's why I tried to mention many times, and I'll mention again here, that this is just one of many, many cases. So many cases. At the beginning of doing my research for this episode, I had the hubris to think that I would be able to cover a couple stories with, with accuracy, with facts and details. But each of these cases, as you open them up, is completely different and faceted and unique. And each of these families is missing someone. And it's so rampant.
Yeah, just those statistics that you started with. I knew the statistics were bad. I didn't quite know they were that bad.
It's quite insidious. And we'll link the study that was conducted by the Urban Indian Health Institute and published on Native Hope. Native Hope focuses on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The acronym is MMIWG.
One thing this kind of leaves me with a big question of as well is, growing up next to a reservation, how many things happen there that I never knew about?
It's a good question.
Makes me think like it's probably a lot. And I know more than the average person because of my sister and my brother-in-law being firefighters and first responders. But the thing is, they also can't tell me anything. Like, they can tell me they went on a call and the basics of what you would really read in the newspaper, because they have to be tight-lipped. It's all part of HIPAA and Medical Act privacy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So anytime they go on a call or anything, exactly. And they take it incredibly seriously.
Which, mad respect. They
but
absolutely
that doesn't mean that
should.
Yeah, she's my sister. Her and I talk about basically everything, but she will never, ever tell me a name. She will never tell me specifics of a call that she's on. I can know generally where she's going. And a big reason why I usually know that is because I hear it on the radio that she is responding to. And that's basically, if you have a police radio, it's kind of the same thing. Mm-hmm. But I know how many calls that she has to go out onto the reservation versus where she has to go in other areas. of the neighboring towns. And I know that she's out there a fair amount, but based on my kind of experience being around her when she makes calls, she's not out there necessarily more than the other areas. At least on my personal experience, the handful of times I've been around her when she's had to run out the door. But I wonder how many things are not being called where she could have responded, or just things that got pushed under the rug with people that I know.
Yeah, it's worth looking into, and I can't recommend it enough. Humbling yourself before this rabbit hole and going down it, because these stories deserve to be told.
They absolutely do.
And that's really the I wish this wasn't the end of the information that I have about Sherry Ann Wounded Foot. But as of today, it is. And
well, hopefully we'll be able to do an update someday.
Hopefully soon.
And give a little more resolution.
Someday.
Thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? You can find us on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, or you can email at us at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. And we'll talk to you later.